On Easter morning, April 20th, 1851, Alabama was wet with spring. The sky bruised violet before dawn, cicadas screaming like broken instruments, soil smelling of iron and rain. The bells of St. Andrew's Church clanged in the distance, calling the faithful to resurrection service. But in one house a different resurrection waited, not of Christ but of memory, fire and revenge stitched into cloth. Moses. That was the name. Slave name, a name forced on him, but a name he carried like stone. 32 years old, lean as a whip, with calloused hands that once cut wood and now pierced fabric. He was tall, shoulders bowed not by nature but by chains, his face dark, eyes steady, lips tight. His body bent when commanded, but his mind carried Ruth, Samuel, and a child never born. Moses had been trained not to build but to serve, not to carve wood but to sew cloth. Mistress Eleanor Whitfield had decided a hammer made men strong, but a needle made them small. And so Moses, who once held saws and planes beside his father Samuel, now held needles finer than a hair, threading white cotton for dresses his back would never wear. The Whitfield plantation spread across Pike County land, fields of cotton waving pale under the Alabama sun. The soil was red, rich, thirsty. The quarters stood crooked, wood warped, air inside heavy with sweat, smoke, and grief. The big house rose proud and pale, whitewashed walls, black shutters like watchful eyes. From its windows, Eleanor Whitfield surveyed her domain. Eleanor, 38 years old, pale face tight as parchment, thin lips pressed into a line. Her voice sharp, her words sharp, her switch sharper. She liked to walk through the house tapping that switch against her palm. Tap, 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 like a clock measuring suffering. She had 3 children, Anne, Sarah, Thomas. Anne, 15, vain, fond of ribbons. Sarah, 12, pale like her mother, always sickly but cruel with her words. Thomas, 8, restless, destructive, once tearing a sparrow in 2 for sport. They called Moses Shadow. They laughed when they said it. Moses was silent, but he heard. He remembered every laugh, every slap. Every night Eleanor threw scraps at him and called it supper. Every time she boasted to her neighbors about her obedient seam hand. Every order to sew finer hems for Anne, prettier ribbons for Sarah, tighter collars for Thomas. Every insult embedded in the fabric. He didn't cry, he just stitched. The weather carried the scent of pine sap and manure, sweat and smoke. Nights filled with mosquitoes whining in ears, days filled with cicadas screaming like punishment. The quarters smelled of wood smoke, boiled cornmeal, wet clothes hung to dry. The big house smelled of polished wood, meat fat, candle wax, and everywhere the smell of iron. From nails, from chains, from the blood that iron drew. Each day Moses rose before dawn. He shoveled embers, stirred mush, then bent over fabric until fingers cramped. Needle in, needle out. Thimble clicking. Cloth sighing. Eleanor passing behind, switch in hand. Tap, tap, tap. His shadow stretched long across the parlor floor, bent, thin, silent. They thought of him as less than man. They thought of him as tool. They thought the needle was harmless. But the needle wasn't for cloth. It was for memory. It was for vengeance. The Whitfield neighbors knew Eleanor's children as lively, well-dressed, sometimes unruly. They saw Anne in her blue ribbons at market, Sarah coughing into lace kerchiefs, Thomas darting like a stray dog. They didn't see the way the children mocked Moses, kicked dust on his legs, pulled at his hair. They didn't see Eleanor striking him across the face with her switch when the hem was crooked, when the thread snapped. They didn't see him walk back to the quarters with blood dripping from his ear, silent, never crying. The house rang with voices, Eleanor's commands, children's shrieks, guests' laughter, but inside Moses's mind, silence. Silence like a blade, silence like a deep well holding names. Ruth, Samuel, the child. He said them to himself with every stitch. He pressed them into the fabric. He carried them in his chest like fire. Eleanor ordered him to finish Easter garments by Saturday night. Anne wanted pale blue, Sarah wanted white lace, Thomas wanted crisp collars. Eleanor wanted all of them finer than her neighbor's children. She handed Moses the cloth. She demanded perfection. Yes, mistress, Moses said, but the fabric felt different in his hands that week. Not cloth, flesh, not thread, sinew, not garments for display, but garments for graves. He moved with quiet precision, shoulders stooped, lips tight. At night, the quarters dark except for faint embers, he stitched. The other slaves slept, their breaths heavy, their dreams heavy. Moses's hands moved by memory. His mind whispered names: Ruth, Samuel, the child. The cloth whispered back, waiting. The Whitfield house had never known silence like the silence Moses carried. A silence that waited, patient like poison under thread. And so Easter approached. The bells of St. Andrew's prepared to toll. The congregation prepared to sing of resurrection. Eleanor Whitfield prepared her children for display. Moses prepared something else. The fields rustled. The soil breathed. The magnolia tree stood heavy with blossoms, sweet scent masking iron. The house windows gleamed. The quarters smoked. The world held its breath. Because on Easter, April 20th, 1851, Alabama would not only witness resurrection, it would witness reckoning. And the name Moses, whispered as shadow, dismissed as tool, scorned as boy, would be remembered. This is the true story of Moses, the slave of Alabama, who sewed poison into cloth, who stitched vengeance into silk and cotton, who carried silence until it burned. Moses was not born in Alabama. He was born in Georgia, 1819, on soil black with pine needles and dew. His mother was Mary, a woman with arms scarred from carrying water, back bent from fields, voice soft like lullabies whispered into night. His father was Samuel, Samuel of the steady hands, Samuel of the carpenter's bench, Samuel who shaped pine into tables, oak into chairs, walnut into coffins, Samuel who whispered to Moses when the stars were clear, "Hands build, son, hands build freedom. Never forget." Moses remembered the smell of shaved wood, the soft curl of sawdust on his father's shirt, the sound of the plane gliding across planks. He remembered sitting small beside Samuel, watching, listening, memorizing. He remembered his mother's hands too, kneading cornmeal dough, brushing his cheek with fingers cracked but gentle. But memory is cruel, because Samuel was sold when Moses was 10. Sold south, they said, loaded onto a wagon with 2 other men, chains around their wrists, dust rising behind wheels. Moses had run after the wagon until his legs failed, until the dust swallowed his father's figure. The last words Samuel gave him, "Hands build." The last image, his father looking back, eyes fierce, then gone. Moses never saw him again. Mary grew weaker each year. She worked the fields until her hands bled. She coughed through nights, spat blood into straw. She told Moses, "Survive." She told him, "Remember names." She died when he was 14, buried with no marker, just soil pressed flat. He didn't cry. He just remembered. Samuel. Mary. Then came Ruth. Ruth with hair braided tight. Ruth with skin glowing in firelight. Ruth with laugh like water running over stones. She was from another plantation, walked 3 miles at night to meet him. They met under a magnolia tree, blossoms falling like pale snow. They jumped the broom one night, quiet ceremony, 2 hearts binding in shadows. No preacher, no papers, just promise. Moses held her hand, said her name like prayer, Ruth. She carried his child once. For a few months her belly swelled, her eyes shone. Moses dreamed of the child's hands, small but strong, holding tools, building something Samuel had spoken of. But dreams shatter in the world of chains. Ruth served in the Whitfield house. She moved with grace, careful, carrying trays heavy with glass. One day Eleanor demanded speed, demanded Ruth move faster. Ruth stumbled. Glass shattered. Eleanor's switch came down hard, again. Ruth fell. Blood ran down her thighs. That night the child slipped away silent into straw and tears. Ruth wept until her voice broke. Her body never healed. She grew thin, fragile. Winter took her like frost takes petals. Moses buried her under the magnolia tree. No stone, just memory. He didn't cry. He just remembered Ruth, the child. Each loss stitched itself into him. Each name became thread knotted into his silence. Samuel, Mary, Ruth, the child. And still Eleanor Whitfield tapped her switch. Tap, tap, tap. She called him boy. She made him sew lace for Sarah, ribbons for Anne, collars for Thomas. She smiled when her guests praised the clothes. She said, "Shadow has clever fingers." She said, "He knows his place." But Moses's fingers knew more. They remembered Samuel's saw, Mary's touch, Ruth's laughter. They remembered the unborn child who never took breath. They remembered blood on straw, blood on earth, blood on hands. The past walked beside him every day. When he bent over fabric, he heard Samuel's hammer striking. When he threaded needles, he saw Mary's fingers tying knots. When he pricked his skin, he thought of Ruth's blood. When he pulled thread tight, he thought of the child never cradled. The quarters were heavy with past wounds too. Old Isaac with one eye, taken in a fight with an overseer. Clara with scars down her back, cut into flesh like words. Joseph who limped, his knee shattered by chains. They whispered stories at night. They whispered names of those sold, those whipped, those lost. They whispered, remember. Memory was weapon. Memory was the only thing chains could not bind. And so Moses carried memory like blade in the dark. He carried silence like fire in the chest. He moved quiet, bent, obedient, sewing hems and sleeves. But inside him Samuel's hammer still struck. Mary's voice still soothed. Ruth's laugh still rang. The child's silence still screamed. He thought of Eleanor's children, Anne, Sarah, Thomas. He thought of how they laughed when he stumbled, how they mocked his silence, how Thomas once threw stones at his shadow, how Anne demanded ribbons red as blood, how Sarah coughed and spat and still found strength to sneer. He thought of them and remembered the unborn child. Why should her children live when his child was taken? Why should Eleanor's bloodline flourish when Ruth was buried, when Samuel was gone, when Mary was dust? Why should laughter echo in that house when silence ruled his life? The answer lay in the needle. Not because it was thread, but because it was sharp, because it was trusted, because Eleanor never looked at it twice. The needle wasn't for sewing, it was for memory. The past had written itself into Moses' skin, into his silence, into his bent shoulders. Each scar was a line, each loss was a paragraph, each stitch was a sentence. The story was unfinished. The ending waited. On the eve of Easter, the bells of St. Andrew's tolled practice chimes. The Whitfield house hummed with preparations. Ham roasting, pies cooling, dresses laid out. Eleanor paced, tapping her switch. The children laughed, tugged at fabrics, boasted of their Easter finery. Moses sewed late into night, needle gleaming in lamplight, his face calm, his hands steady. But every pull of thread was guided by ghosts. Samuel's hammer, Mary's cough, Ruth's scream, the child's silence. The past wounds throbbed like open flesh. But wounds do not stay wounds forever. Sometimes they harden. Sometimes they sharpen. Sometimes they become weapons. And in Moses' hands they had. He didn't cry. He just remembered. The night was heavy. The Alabama sky pressed down, thick with the scent of pine pitch and wet soil. The swamp hummed with frogs and the cicadas sang in endless waves, but inside Moses there was only silence. Silence like stone, silence like rope tightening, silence that had waited too long. For years he had bent his back. For years he had lowered his eyes. For years he had bitten his tongue, until the taste of iron and blood became part of him. But Easter of 1851, that was the moment the silence cracked. That was the season when the slave named Moses could no longer bear the weight of chains and grief. He was mending shirts in the dim light of a tallow candle when it happened. The mistress's son, Thomas, 12 years old, blue-eyed, cruel in the way only a child taught cruelty could be, came running through the room. He grabbed the cloth Moses worked on, dragged it across the dirt floor and laughed. "Faster, slave. Faster with your needle," Thomas shouted, his voice a whip sharper than leather. The mistress, Eleanor, stood in the doorway. She did not scold the boy. She did not stop him. She only smiled thinly, the way she always did, as if each insult was a seed she planted, seeds of hatred watered daily. Moses said nothing. He bent again. His needle moved slow, precise like a heartbeat. But inside something shifted. The thread in his hands was no longer thread. It was memory. It was vengeance waiting for a stitch. That same week, Ruth and his wife guard collapsed in the field. The sun beat down merciless. The air smelled of sweat and dust, and Ruth fell with a low moan that cut through him like a blade. She had been coughing for months. The overseer said it was laziness. The mistress said it was weakness. Moses knew it was hunger, overwork, sorrow. He knelt beside her, whispered her name, Ruth, Ruth, but the overseer's whip cracked the air. "Leave her. Back to work," the overseer barked. Moses rose, fists clenched, eyes blazing. But Ruth shook her head. Even weak, even trembling, she shook her head, whispering, "Not yet, Moses, not yet." He obeyed. He returned to the row. But as he bent over the soil, the smell of earth filling his nostrils, his heart hardened. Ruth's cough echoed in his ears. Ruth's trembling became his fire. And then came the breaking point. The moment no man could endure without shattering. The mistress sent him to the wash-house with garments, her bonnet, her children's clothes, the shawl she wore to church. She told him to repair every tear, to stitch every loose seam. Her voice was sweet, but it carried the sharp edge of command. As he carried the bundle, Moses passed the cookhouse. There on a shelf, jars of dried leaves and powders lined the wall. Some were herbs for medicine, some were roots for tea. But one particular jar held crushed oleander leaves, bitter, deadly, gathered by a woman long ago who knew the language of poison. Moses paused. His eyes fixed on it. The world fell quiet. The jar was meant for rats, the mistress had said, for vermin in the grain. But in that moment Moses knew, the leaves are not for rats. They are for her, for them, for the house that killed Ruth slowly and Samuel swiftly. His hand closed around the jar. His pulse pounded, and the silence within him broke. That night in the quarters he worked by candlelight. The other slaves slept restlessly, moaning in their dreams, turning on straw pallets. But Moses did not sleep. He ground the leaves fine as dust, the air filled with a bitter, choking scent. He coughed once, twice, then pressed on. He dipped his needle in the powder. He rubbed it into the thread. Each stitch he made carried death. Each stitch was a prayer answered. Each stitch was a name repeated. Samuel, Ruth, Samuel, Ruth. He remembered Samuel, his father, broken on the whipping post. He remembered Ruth coughing blood into her hands. He remembered his own silence, his bowed head, his bound wrists. And he said to himself with each thrust of the needle, not because I am weak, not because I am afraid, but because they took everything, and now I take it back. The garments grew heavy in his lap. Heavy not with cloth, but with fate. The bonnet smelled of lavender, but beneath it clung the bitter ghost of oleander. The children's shirts looked white and pure, but their seams carried dust darker than sin. The needle moved. The candle flickered. His face shone with sweat. His hands did not shake. Outside, the wind howled. The pines groaned. Somewhere a whippoorwill sang its mournful cry. The whole earth seemed to hold its breath. By dawn it was done. The clothes lay folded neatly as they always did. The poison was hidden, invisible, waiting. Moses carried them to the big house. His face was blank, his steps steady. The mistress thanked him with a glance, nothing more. She did not see the shadow in his eyes. She did not feel the storm gathering in his chest. She lifted the bonnet, placed it on her head, and smiled faintly in the mirror. The children ran laughing, tugging on their fresh shirts. To them it was only cloth. To Moses it was the silent edge of justice. That evening Ruth's cough grew worse. She lay curled on the straw, her breath shallow. Moses sat beside her, holding her hand. She whispered his name, barely a breath, barely a sound. Moses. He bent low. He listened. Do not bow again, she said. Not ever again. Her eyes closed. Sleep claimed her, but Moses did not sleep. He stared at the rafters of the cabin, where smoke stains spread like black wings. He whispered to the dark, it is done. The needle has spoken, and soon they will answer. Easter Sunday dawned bright and cruel. The church bells rang. The fields shimmered in morning light. The mistress dressed in her bonnet, the children in their fresh shirts. They walked to the carriage, their voices light, their laughter sharp. But Moses heard something else beneath their joy, the slow, hidden drumbeat of poison working in blood. The echo of his father's name, the whisper of Ruth's cough. The breaking point is never loud. It is not the crack of a whip, nor the roar of a master. It is quiet, a thread, a needle, a jar of leaves. It is silence turned sharp, and once broken, silence cannot be mended again. The bell rang for supper. The house glowed with candles. The mistress sat at the head of the long table, her bonnet tilted just so, her hands folded with grace. The children laughed, their new shirts crisp and white, their voices sharp as silver bells. The master carved meat with a steady hand, his knife slicing through fat and bone. The air smelled of roasted pork, of sweet cornbread, of molasses dripped slow on plates. But underneath it, faint, bitter, ghostly, there was another scent, the scent of oleander clinging to seams, a poison smell hidden, waiting. Moses stood in the doorway, head bowed, tray in hand. He did not eat. He did not drink. He only watched. watched as his stitches breathed, watched as his thread worked its way into blood and bone. At first it was nothing. A cough here, a child rubbing his stomach. The mistress pressing fingers to her temple, sighing at a sudden throb of pain. The master grumbling at sour wine. But then the coughs grew harsher. The child's laughter broke into a whimper. One dropped a fork, clutching his belly, his face pale. The mistress trembled, her lips dry, her voice cracking as she whispered grace again, as though prayer could stop the tide already rising inside her. The candles flickered. The laughter died. The supper table grew cold. By midnight, the house was a fevered tomb. The eldest boy burned with heat, his breath ragged. The youngest cried until his voice broke, then fell into silence more frightening than screams. The mistress lay sweating, shaking, her bonnet cast aside, her hair clinging damp to her forehead. The master cursed, shouting for doctors, for cures, for answers. He shouted at slaves, shouted at walls, shouted at God, but shouting could not drain poison. Shouting could not undo the thread already sewn. Moses carried water to their bedsides. His steps were slow, his eyes unreadable. When the mistress's hand grabbed his wrist, trembling, he looked down at her with the same silence he had carried for years. She whispered, "Help me. Help my children." He did not cry. He did not pray. He only said, "I did." She did not understand. She never had. By dawn, the first child was gone. The eldest daughter. Her skin pale as linen, her lips blue. She had worn the white dress Moses mended, the one with seams dusted in oleander. She lay stiff in her bed while the mistress screamed, tearing her hair, cursing the world. The slaves in the quarters heard the wailing, but no one dared move. They sat in silence, listening. They knew the sound of death stalking the big house, the sound of chains breaking in shadows. The second child followed, and then the third. Fever consumed them like fire lapping at dry wood. One by one, they withered. One by one, the garments Moses had touched became their winding cloths. The master staggered through the hallways, pistol in hand, wild-eyed, demanding answers. His boots struck hard against the wood. His voice thundered, "Which of you did this?" The slaves trembled. They swore innocence. They begged. But Moses stood still, his eyes steady, his breath calm. The master's gaze lingered on him long and hard. His finger twitched on the trigger. But the mistress wailed again, pulling him back. The sickness took too much of his attention. And Moses was left standing, shadowed, waiting. The house smelled of vomit, of sweat, of sickness. Curtains were drawn, candles burned at all hours. The piano sat silent. The Bible on the table lay closed. In the quarters, whispers spread like sparks. Some praised Moses in hushed tones. "He's doing what none of us dared." Others cursed his name. "He'll bring the lash, he'll bring the rope, he'll bring death for us all." But Moses spoke little. He sat by Ruth at night, holding her hand, listening to her cough. Each spasm of her chest hardened his resolve. Each drop of blood on her lips reminded him, one for Samuel, one for Ruth, one for every chain. The overseer grew suspicious. He cornered Moses in the barn, whip in hand. "You touched their clothes," he hissed. "I have sowed their death." Moses met his gaze, unflinching. His silence was sharper than any denial. The whip cracked across his back. Flesh split. Blood ran again. Still Moses did not cry out. He bit the pain, swallowed it whole, and held it like fuel. The overseer spat, disgusted. "Devil's got you. But I'll see you hang." He was wrong. The devil had nothing to do with it. It was memory, it was grief, it was justice in the shape of thread. Another child died. The mistress fainted over the small body, her sobs breaking the night. The master, half-mad, called in preachers, doctors, healers. They prayed over the beds, sprinkled holy water, burned herbs. But the poison had already written its scripture. It was not prayer that moved through their veins. It was Moses' hand, Moses' silence. Then the mistress herself faltered. Her lips cracked, her breath rattled. Her skin grew yellow and hot. She begged for relief, begged for salvation. She did not know that the bonnet she wore to Easter church, the bonnet Moses stitched so carefully, had carried death against her very skin. As she lay dying, she called out for her children, for her husband, for God. She did not call out for Moses, she never would. But Moses, standing in the doorway, whispered her name in his heart, not with love, not with sorrow, but with finality. "Eleanor, Eleanor, Eleanor." The master roared with rage. He gathered the slaves in the yard, pistol-drawn veins bulging. "One of you did this," he bellowed, "and I'll have the truth or I'll have blood." The slaves trembled, their eyes wide, their hands lifted. Some pointed at Moses, desperate to save themselves. Some kept silent, too afraid to speak. The master's eyes burned into Moses. For a long moment the world stilled. But then the mistress screamed from inside, her voice ragged, broken. The master turned, running back to her side. Moses remained standing in the yard, his face carved from stone. One by one, the great house of Alabama crumbled. Not from fire, not from revolt with torches and blades, but from the smallest of weapons, a needle, a thread, a handful of leaves ground to dust. The house had never been so quiet. Quiet, not because peace reigned, but because death had settled in every room. Justice does not always come with flames. Sometimes it comes in silence, stitched into seams, hidden where no eye can see. Sometimes the reckoning walks not with swords, but with needles. And sometimes the smallest hand leaves the deepest scar. Dawn comes slow over Alabama. The Easter sun rises pale, as though afraid to shine on what has been done. The Carter household is silent now. Silent in a way it has never been before. The laughter of children is gone. The scolding voice of Elizabeth Carter is gone. The echo of shoes on polished floors gone. Only the smell remains. The bitter, sweet, metallic smell of sickness, of vomit, of death lingering in fabric and air. The neighbors speak first. They whisper of God's wrath, of a curse laid upon the Carters, a sickness that struck too quick, too sharp. Children dead in their Sunday clothes. A mistress collapsed beside her silver mirror, eyes wide, lips foaming. Easter meant resurrection, but here it meant burial. The bells of the small church ring, not for celebration, but for mourning. And Moses? Moses does not run. He does not hide. He stands in the fields at sunrise, bare hands brushing against the cotton that has stolen his skin for years. He feels the dew cold against his fingers, and he feels alive. For the first time alive. They look for him. They call his name not as a command, but as a question. Where is Moses? Who saw Moses? It does not take long. Slaves are always watched, always suspected, always accused. A neighbor finds the scraps of poisoned leaves beneath the floorboards of his cabin. The overseer remembers his silence, his stillness, the way he watched without blinking. They bind his wrists. They drag him to the yard where the Carters once stood tall. They ask why. Why would he do such a thing? Why kill the mistress? Why kill the children? But Moses doesn't answer. He doesn't cry. He just looks at them, eyes dark, steady, unbroken. The rope scratches against his skin. The mob shouts. They want blood. But Moses only repeats the names under his breath. Ruth, Samuel, Jacob, Naomi. The names no one else remembers. One for every lash, one for every hunger, one for every night of silence. The records say he was hanged. Some say it was quick, others say it was slow. Some say he spoke at the end. Others swear he never said a word. The truth is lost in the noise of ropes, in the snapping of branches, in the cries of a crowd eager for spectacle. But one thing remains: he did not beg. He did not bend. He did not break. The Carters were buried in polished coffins laid beneath stone markers that still stand. Moses was buried in the dirt, without a marker, without a prayer. But the story did not stay buried. It traveled on whispered tongues, carried by those who worked the fields, those who saw the fire in his silence. They told it in secret by candlelight when they dared to hope. They told their children and their children's children. They said Moses remembered, Moses avenged. Moses turned the tools of servitude, needle and thread, into weapons sharper than any blade. They called it poison, but to the enslaved it was justice. They called it murder, but to the broken it was resistance. They called it sin, but to the silenced it was freedom. Years later, when the war came and the South trembled, the story of Moses rose again. A reminder that even in chains there was defiance, that even in silence there was strength, that even the smallest act, stitching, sewing, could unravel an empire of cruelty. The fields are quiet now. The houses crumble, the cotton rots, but the memory remains. His name remains. Moses of Alabama, the man who sewed death into Easter clothes, the man who did not wait for deliverance to fall from heaven, but carved it with his own hands, stitch by stitch, name by name. If this story chills you, it is because it is real. If it haunts you, it is because it was meant to haunt. To remember is to resist forgetting. This was the true story of Moses of Alabama, the one who turned fabric into fire, the one who turned silence into vengeance, the one who showed that even the forgotten could not be erased. And before you go, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. Don't forget to subscribe, because these are the stories they tried to bury, and we are here to dig them back up.